Silas Morton stood in the doorway of James Whitmore's cabin, his mouth hanging open in a way that would have embarrassed him under any other circumstances. The big man had seen strange things in his 12 years on the Wyoming frontier. He had watched lightning strike a pine tree and turn it to splinters. He had seen a grizzly bear take 3 rifle shots and keep coming. He had pulled a trapper from a frozen river and watched the man's clothes turn to ice before they could get him to shelter. But this made no sense at all. Outside, the Wyoming wind cut across the Sweetwater River Valley like a blade. The temperature held at 18 degrees below zero. Too cold for snow to fall. Too cold for anything to move unless it absolutely had to. Silas's breath had frozen into white lace across his beard. His fingers ached inside thick leather gloves. This was the kind of cold that killed a man if he made mistakes. Inside James Whitmore's cabin, something impossible was happening. James stood in the middle of the single room wearing a cotton work shirt and canvas pants. No coat, no blanket wrapped around his shoulders. And his feet were bare, not dancing across the floor to avoid the frozen earth, not hopping from one foot to the other. Just standing there comfortable like he was standing on summer grass. The cabin should have been a death trap. Every cabin in the territory was a death trap in cold like this. You could burn a cord of wood and still freeze to death in the corners. The floor was always the worst. That packed earth pulled heat out of a man's body through boot leather, through wool socks, straight into the frozen ground below. But James Whitmore was standing barefoot on his cabin floor in 18 below zero weather, and he was smiling. "Come in, Silas," James said quietly. "You will understand." Silas stepped across the threshold and felt his world turn upside down. The air inside the cabin was not just warm, it was genuinely deeply warm. The kind of warmth Silas only felt when standing directly next to a roaring fire. But James's fireplace held only a moderate flame. Nothing special, actually smaller than the fire Silas had been feeding all night in his own cabin 3 miles south. How in the name of God Silas started then stopped. He pulled off one glove and knelt down on the floor. When his palm touched the packed earth, Silas jerked his hand back like he had touched a hot stove. The floor was warm, not slightly warm, not tepid, genuinely warm like the skin of a living person. "What the hell is happening here?" Whitmore James's smile widened. The first real smile Silas had seen on the man's face since January, when James had buried his wife and children. "Heat does not rise, Silas. It travels through the floor first." Silas looked up at his neighbor, at the man the whole territory had called crazy for the past 6 months, and realized he had been completely wrong about James Whitmore. The man was not crazy at all. He was a genius. 4 years earlier, in the spring of 1839, James Whitmore had stood on this same piece of land with his wife Eleanor beside him. The land stretched empty in all directions. 160 acres of Wyoming territory, bottomland near the Sweetwater River. Good soil, access to water, timber on the ridges, everything a man needed to build a life. Eleanor Whitmore was 26 years old, the daughter of a Presbyterian minister from Pennsylvania. She had chosen this, chosen frontier hardship over Eastern comfort, chosen a lean young man with strong hands and a quiet determination over the safe, predictable men her father had preferred. "This will be our home," James said. His voice carried a pride that made Eleanor's chest tighten. She did not complain, did not cry, did not ask if they had made a mistake. She had chosen this man and this life, and she would make it work. James built their cabin through the summer of 1839. He worked from first light until dark, felling ponderosa pine, trimming the logs to 16-foot lengths, notching the corners with careful precision. Each log weighed more than 200 pounds, but James had worked as a timberman in Virginia before coming west. He knew how to move heavy wood. The cabin rose slowly, 16 feet by 20 feet, walls 8 inches thick. He chinked the gaps between logs with clay and moss packed tight against the wind. The fireplace he built from river rock, choosing each stone for how flat its faces were, how well it would stack. He mixed clay mortar and laid the rocks with patience, building a firebox that would draw properly a chimney that would not catch the roof on fire. The roof he covered with split shake shingles 3 layers deep, thick enough to hold the weight of winter snow. By September, the cabin was finished. One door facing south to catch the sun, 2 small windows that Eleanor covered with oiled paper when the cold came. Inside, James built a rope bed frame and filled a mattress with prairie grass. He cut planks and built shelves along one wall, a table from hewn wood, 3 chairs, though there were only 2 of them at first. Their first winter in Wyoming was hard but survivable. James kept the fireplace burning. Eleanor cooked meals that stretched their supplies. They held each other through the Wasmong dark nights and talked about the future. In March of 1840, Eleanor gave birth to a son. They named him Benjamin, a healthy boy with his mother's dark hair. He cried with strong lungs and nursed well. James held his son and felt something shift in his chest, a new kind of responsibility, a new kind of fear. In September of 1841, Sarah was born, smaller than her brother but loud, so loud. Eleanor laughed when the baby screamed. "That one has spirit," she said. James built a cradle. Eleanor sewed small clothes. The cabin that had seemed spacious for 2 adults now held the sounds of children. Laughter, crying, the accumulated evidence of a family building a life in wild country. James worked the land. He planted wheat in the bottomland near the river. The growing season was short, but the soil was good. He hunted elk and antelope to supplement their supplies. He trapped beaver and fox in the spring, selling furs at Owen Blackwood's trading post 40 miles east. The work was endless, but James thrived on it. He was competent, careful, strong enough to handle the physical demands of frontier agriculture. Their second winter was manageable. Their third winter was cold, but they survived it. Life was hard, but good. James noticed one thing. No matter how hot he kept the fire burning, the floor stayed frozen. He could feel cold radiating up through his boot leather. But it did not seem dangerous, just the way things were, the way they had always been. That was his mistake, the worst mistake of his life. December of 1842 arrived with temperatures that dropped below anything James had experienced. The cold came down from the north in waves, each one colder than the last. By mid-December morning, temperatures held at 20 below zero. By late December, the thermometer James kept outside the door registered 32 below on 3 consecutive mornings. Inside the cabin, James fed the fireplace constantly. Every 2 hours, day and night, he added logs. The fire roared, filling the stone firebox, completely flames reaching up toward the chimney throat. Near the fireplace, the air was warm enough that Eleanor could cook without her shawl. 3 feet from the fire, their breath formed clouds. At the far corners of the cabin, everything froze solid. The floor was the worst. Despite the roaring fire, the packed earth floor remained frozen. James could feel cold radiating up through the soles of his heavy boots, through 2 pairs of wool socks into the bones of his feet. At night, Eleanor piled every blanket they owned onto the rope bed frame. Benjamin and Sarah slept together, their small bodies pressed close for warmth. Eleanor lay between them and the outer wall, using her own body to block the cold that seeped through the logs despite the chinking. James barely slept. He maintained the fire through the night, adding wood whenever the flames diminished. He watched his family shiver under their blankets and felt helpless. The fire was doing everything it should do. The problem was that heat rose. The warmest air in the cabin collected near the ceiling, then escaped through tiny gaps in the roof. The coldest air settled at floor level, right where his children tried to sleep. On January 4th, 1843, Sarah woke with a cough. By evening, she had a fever. Eleanor held her daughter close to the fire, but the child shivered uncontrollably. 2 days later, Benjamin developed the same cough. James rode through brutal cold to Owen Blackwood's trading post, 40 miles through country that wanted to kill him. His fingers went numb inside his gloves. His face went numb beneath his scarf. But he made it to the trading post and bought what medicine was available. Willow bark tea, camphor, basic remedies that might help or might do nothing. He rode back through the same killing cold and delivered the medicine to Eleanor. She dosed the children with willow bark tea. She kept them as close to the fire as was safely possible. For 3 days, it seemed Sarah might recover. Her fever broke on January 7th, but Benjamin got worse. His small body could not generate enough heat to fight both the sickness and the relentless cold. He died on January 9th, 1843, 4 days before his 3rd birthday. Eleanor held their son's body and did not cry. It was too cold to cry. Tears would freeze on her face. Sarah followed her brother on January 11th. She called for her mother, once a weak sound barely audible. Then she was gone. Eleanor held both children through that night. The fire still burned. The heat still rose uselessly toward the ceiling. The floor stayed frozen. Eleanor developed pneumonia on January 13th. Her body, weakened by grief and exhaustion, could not fight. James held his wife and felt her grow colder. On January 18th, Eleanor Whitmore died in her husband's arms. James buried her that afternoon. He had to build a fire on the frozen ground and let it burn for 3 hours before the earth was soft enough to dig. He buried Eleanor next to their children, 3 graves in a row, 50 yards from the cabin door. He made 3 crosses from pine wood and pounded them into the half-frozen earth. Then he walked back to the cabin. The fire still burned, the floor was still frozen, and James Whitmore began to think. The week after he buried Eleanor, James sat motionless on the frozen floor of his cabin and stared at the fire. Neighbors came with food. Silas Morton brought smoked venison. James left it on the table until it spoiled. Henry and Mary Pritchard brought a basket of cornbread. James did not look at it. On January 23rd, Henry Pritchard rode over to check on James. He found him sitting on the floor near the fireplace, eyes fixed on the flames, completely unresponsive. Henry spoke to him. James did not react. Henry waved his hand in front of James's face. Nothing. Henry left troubled and told the other settlers what he had seen. The community reached a consensus. Grief has broken his mind, they said. Poor man has lost everything, gone mad from it. But they were wrong. Inside James Whitmore's head was not chaos. It was focus. Absolute crystalline focus. He lay on the frozen floor and felt cold seeping into his spine. He watched the fire burn and saw heat shimmer upward, rising toward the ceiling, toward the roof, toward the empty sky, completely wasted. His family had died 10 feet from a fire hot enough to cook meat and boil water. They had died because heat went up and they lived down. The unfairness of it consumed him. One question played over and over in his mind. Where does the heat go after it leaves the chimney? Most settlers, when faced with a cold cabin, simply burned more wood. James began to wonder if the problem was not the amount of heat, but the path it took. Heat rose because hot air was lighter than cold air. This was natural law, unchangeable. But what if the heat could be forced to travel horizontally before it rose? What if it could be made to pass through the floor before escaping into the sky? The idea formed slowly over weeks of observation and thought. During the 3rd week of February, James started to move. He studied his fireplace with the intensity of a man trying to memorize scripture. He observed how flames pulled air from the cabin and sent it up the chimney. He put his hand near the stonework and felt how this rock absorbed heat, then radiated it into the room. He climbed onto the roof and examined the chimney, noting how heat escaped into the winter air. He began asking questions no one could answer. In early May, James rode east to a settlement near Fort Laramie, where a man named Jacob Stern operated a brickmaking operation. Stern had immigrated from Pennsylvania 2 years earlier and brought knowledge of commercial brick production. His kiln was the only one within 200 miles. James arrived at Stern's operation on a Tuesday morning and asked if he could watch the kiln work. Stern, accustomed to curiosity from settlers who had never seen bricks manufactured, agreed easily. Sure, he said. Watch all you want. What Stern expected was a few hours of casual observation. What he got was 3 full days of intense study. James watched everything. He observed how Stern loaded wet bricks into the kiln chamber. He studied the firebox design, noting how flames entered at one end. He paid particular attention to the kiln's underground flue system. The kiln was essentially a large brick dome. Beneath this dome, Stern had built channels that carried heat from the firebox through the entire kiln floor before venting through a chimney on the opposite end. The principle was simple but effective. Hot air and smoke, instead of rising directly up, were forced to travel horizontally through brick tunnels. As the heat traveled, it warmed the bricks from below. By the time the exhaust reached the exit chimney, much of its heat had transferred into the kiln structure and the bricks inside. James asked questions. How wide are the underground channels? 8 inches, Stern answered. How deep are they buried? 6 inches below the kiln floor. What keeps the channels from collapsing? They are built from brick vaulted in an arched shape that supports the earth above. How long does heat continue radiating from the kiln floor after the fire goes out? Stern thought about this. Hours, he said. Sometimes a full day if the firing has been hot enough. Does the system require constant fire to maintain heat? No, Stern explained. One good firing will keep the kiln warm enough to dry bricks for 2 days. The heat stored in the brick and earth releases slowly. James spent the third day simply sitting beside the kiln, watching how heat moved through Stern's system. He placed his hand on the kiln floor and felt warmth radiating upward. He examined the exit chimney and noted that smoke emerged much cooler than it would from a normal fire. James left Stern's brick operation with a theory forming in his mind. Heat could be forced to travel horizontally through underground channels. Heat traveling through such channels would warm the earth and any structure above it. Heat that warmed a floor would radiate upward into a living space. The principle was sound. The question was whether it could be adapted from brick kiln to frontier cabin. In mid-June, James made his annual trip to St. Louis to sell furs he had trapped during spring. The journey took 3 weeks by horseback, following established trails east through the plains. Most trappers look forward to St. Louis as a chance to drink gamble and spend their earnings on entertainment. James had different priorities. He spent his first day in the city locating every bakery, foundry, and industrial operation that used fire for manufacturing. He introduced himself as a settler interested in heating methods. Most operators thought his questions were strange but harmless enough. A German baker named Otto Kessler showed James his bread ovens, which used a design brought from Bavaria. The ovens featured thick brick walls and a floor system where heat from the firebox traveled through channels beneath the baking surface before exiting. Kessler explained that this design meant he could fire the oven once in early morning and bake bread throughout the day on residual heat. The floor stays hot for 8 to 10 hours after the fire dies, Kessler said. James examined the oven's construction carefully. He noted how Kessler had built the underground channels using fire brick arranged in a curved pattern. The channels were approximately 10 inches wide and 12 inches deep. Clay mortar sealed the joints. Above the channels, a layer of sand provided insulation and distributed heat evenly across the baking floor. At a foundry near the riverfront, James watched workers pour molten iron. He was not interested in the metalwork itself, but in how the foundry managed heat distribution. The facility used a system of brick flues that carried hot exhaust from furnaces through the building before venting outside. A foreman explained that this captured waste heat kept the entire foundry warm during winter. The system requires careful engineering, the foreman said, to prevent backdraft and ensure proper airflow. James asked about pipe diameter airflow calculations and chimney height ratios. The foreman, impressed by the questions, sketched basic principles on a piece of slate. Hot air rises, he said, but it can be channeled horizontally if the path is clear and the exit point is higher than the entry point. Wider channels move more air, but lose heat faster. Narrower channels retain heat, but can become blocked by ash or condensation. James spent 2 weeks in St. Louis studying heating systems with the intensity of a university student. He filled a small journal with sketches and notes. He measured pipe diameters and channel depths. He asked about materials, construction, methods, and failure points. People thought he was odd, this lean frontiersman, obsessed with ovens and flues. But they answered his questions. When James left St. Louis in early July, he carried supplies other trappers would have considered wasteful. He had purchased 30 sections of fired clay drainage pipe, each section 2 feet long and 6 inches in diameter. He bought iron bands designed for barrel construction. He acquired 2 bags of lime for mortar. He purchased a small bellows and a set of masonry tools. The total cost consumed most of his first sale earnings, 8 months of trapping work. Other trappers heading back to the mountains saw his loaded pack horses and made jokes about Whitmore finally losing his mind completely. James did not care what they thought. He had work to do. He returned to his Wyoming cabin in late July 1843. The wheat he had planted in May stood knee-high. The vegetable garden showed promising growth. His cabin, empty of family, waited exactly as he had left it. He unloaded his supplies and stacked the clay pipe sections carefully inside the cabin. The next morning, Silas Morton stopped by. Silas was James's nearest neighbor, homesteading land 3 miles south. He was a large man, quick to laugh, and equally quick to offer opinions on matters he did not fully understand. He had come to welcome James back and see what supplies had been purchased in St. Louis. When Silas saw the clay pipes stacked against the cabin wall, his expression shifted from friendly curiosity to concern. He picked up one of the pipe sections, turning it in his hands. "These are drainage pipes," he said. "What are you draining?" James was cutting leather straps to secure his saddle. He did not look up. "I am not draining anything." Silas waited for further explanation. When none came, he pressed the question. Then why did you buy 30 sections of drainage pipe? I am going to install them under my cabin floor, James said. To move heat from the fireplace. Silas stared at him. You are going to dig up your floor, James nodded, and bury pipes underneath. Yes. To move heat. Yes. Silas set the pipe section down carefully. He spoke slowly the way a man might speak to someone suffering from sun sickness. James, heat rises. Everyone knows this. You cannot make heat travel through underground pipes. It will just rise up and escape. That is the point, James said. Heat rises, but it can be channeled first. If I force the hot air from my fireplace to travel through pipes under the floor before it exits through a chimney, the pipes and the earth around them will absorb heat. That heat will radiate upward through the floor. Silas shook his head. That is not how heat works. You are wasting money and time on madness. Grief has broken your thinking. James continued working on his leather straps. His voice remained level. I have seen systems like this in St. Louis. They work. Bakeries use them. Foundries use them. Brick kilns use them. You are not baking bread, Silas said, his voice rising. You are trying to heat a cabin. This is different. The principle is the same, James replied. Silas left frustrated. Within days, word spread through the scattered settler community. James Whitmore, driven mad by the loss of his family, was planning to tear up his cabin floor and bury drainage pipes underneath. The story grew with each retelling. Some versions claimed he believed he could heat his entire cabin with a single candle. Others suggested he was building an elaborate grave for his wife and children underneath the cabin floor. In early August, Henry Pritchard rode over to check on James. He found James measuring the cabin's interior, making marks on the floor with charcoal. Henry asked gently if James had truly thought through what he was planning. James showed him the journal from St. Louis filled with sketches and calculations. He explained the physics of heat transfer, thermal mass, and radiant warming. Henry listened politely but remained unconvinced. Even if it works, he said, you will spend months building something that might give you slightly warmer floors. Is that worth destroying your cabin? James looked at Henry for a long moment. His voice was quiet, but there was steel in it. If it prevents one more family from freezing, James said. Then yes. On August 15, 1843, James Whitmore began dismantling his cabin floor. The floor was packed earth, smoothed and hardened by 3 years of use. Eleanor had swept it daily, keeping the surface as clean as a dirt floor could be. Benjamin had taken his first steps on this floor. Sarah had played here with corn husk dolls Eleanor had made. To the neighbors who occasionally passed by from a distance, watching James Whitmore tear it up seemed like desecration. James started at the fireplace. He used a mattock to break through the hardened surface, then a shovel to remove the loosened earth. His plan required a primary channel running from the fireplace across the cabin's length to a secondary chimney he would build on the opposite wall. This main channel would be 20 feet long. From this primary channel, he would dig 4 lateral branches, each extending 8 feet toward the cabin sides. The pattern would resemble a tree with the fireplace's roots and branches spreading heat throughout the floor. The work was brutal. The earth beneath the cabin floor was dense, filled with rocks that had to be pried out individually. James worked from dawn until dark, making slow progress. After 3 days, he had excavated a trench 1 foot deep and 10 inches wide, extending 6 feet from the fireplace. On the 4th day, Silas Morton stopped by. He stood in the doorway looking at the torn-up floor, the piles of dirt, the destroyed interior. This is insanity, he said. You had a functional cabin. Now you have a construction site. Winter will be here in 3 months. What if you do not finish? Then I will sleep in a cabin with trenches in the floor, James said, continuing to dig. Silas left shaking his head. That evening, Henry Pritchard arrived with his wife, Mary. They brought a basket of food and genuine concern. Mary looked at the destruction and began crying softly. James, she said, this is not healthy. You are tearing apart your home. You need to stop and think clearly. I am thinking clearly, James said. For the first time since January, I am thinking clearly. But you are destroying everything, Henry protested. The cabin was fine. James stopped digging. He straightened up and looked at Henry. His voice was harder than Henry had ever heard it. It was not fine, James said. It was a death trap. It looked like shelter, but it killed my family anyway. I will not let it kill anyone else. The Pritchards left troubled. Word spread further. Settlers began using James's name as a cautionary tale. Grief can break a man's mind, they said. Look at Whitmore tearing up his own floor because he cannot accept that winter killed his family. By early September, James had completed the main channel and two of the lateral branches. His cabin looked like a battlefield. Dirt piles stood everywhere. Trenches crisscrossed the floor. The structure remained sound, but the interior was chaos. James did not care what others thought. He had calculations to follow and a system to build. The mockery meant nothing compared to the work. He worked from principles he had observed rather than formal engineering knowledge. He understood that hot air would travel through his underground channels only if certain conditions were met. The exit chimney had to be higher than the fireplace entrance. The channels had to slope gradually upward to prevent air from pooling. The pipe diameter had to balance airflow against heat retention. Too wide and heat would escape before warming the earth. Too narrow and the system would choke on its own smoke. He calculated the optimal pipe diameter through trial and observation. At Jacob Stern's brick kiln, the underground channels had been 8 inches wide. Otto Kessler's bakery ovens used 10-inch channels. Both systems moved large volumes of hot air quickly. James's cabin was smaller. He needed heat to move slowly, transferring warmth to surrounding earth before exiting. He decided on 6-inch diameter pipes. The clay sections he had purchased from St. Louis matched this specification perfectly. The slope calculation required more thought. James knew that water would flow through a pipe sloped at 1 inch per 10 feet. Hot air was lighter than water and more eager to rise. He estimated he could use a gentler slope, perhaps 1 inch per 20 feet. His main channel ran 20 feet from fireplace to exit chimney. A 1-inch rise over that distance would create sufficient draft without rushing air through too quickly. He measured and marked the cabin floor accordingly. The lateral branches presented a different problem. These channels would extend perpendicular to the main trunk, carrying heat toward the cabin sides, but they would end in closed caps, not exits. Would hot air travel into dead-end channels? James reasoned that it would be driven by pressure from air behind it, and by the fact that the closed ends would be warmer than outside air, creating convective circulation. The earth surrounding these branch channels would absorb heat and radiate upward. He decided the branch channels should be slightly narrower than the main trunk to slow air movement and increase heat transfer. He would use 5-inch diameter sections for the lateral branches. The depth of burial mattered significantly. Bury the pipes too shallow and heat would escape through the cabin floor too quickly, potentially making the surface uncomfortably hot. Bury them too deep and the earth would insulate the pipes, preventing heat from reaching the living space. Stern's kiln buried channels 6 inches below the floor surface. Kessler's ovens used 8 inches. James split the difference, deciding on 7 inches of earth cover above his pipes. This would place the pipe tops 13 inches below the original floor surface, accounting for the 6-inch pipe diameter. The exit chimney required careful positioning. James planned to build it on the cabin's north wall opposite the fireplace. The chimney top would extend 3 feet above the roof line, creating draft. The base would connect to the main underground channel. Between the underground exit and the above-ground chimney, he would build a vertical stone shaft similar to his fireplace chimney but narrower. He sketched these calculations in his journal. The drawings were crude but functional. He had no formal training, but he understood the principles well enough to build something that should work. Whether it would work remained to be proven. By mid-September, James had excavated all 5 trenches. The main channel ran straight from fireplace to the north wall. 4 lateral branches extended perpendicular, 2 on each side of the main trunk, spaced to distribute heat evenly across the cabin floor. The trenches resembled a crude map of veins spreading through the earth. Each trench measured 10 inches wide at the top, tapering to 8 inches at the bottom. The depth varied according to his slope calculations, ranging from 12 inches deep at the fireplace end to 13 inches at the exit chimney location. The earth removed from these trenches filled one corner of his cabin in a massive pile. James would use this soil later for backfill. Before installing pipes, James addressed drainage. Underground channels carrying hot smoke would produce condensation as hot air met cold earth. Water would form inside the pipes and needed somewhere to go. If it pooled, it would block airflow or freeze during winter, destroying the system. James's solution was elegant. He dug small sumps at the lowest point of each lateral branch, extending 6 inches deeper than the main channel floor. These sumps would collect condensation, allowing it to seep into the earth below rather than filling the pipes. In the main channel, he created a gentle, continuous slope that would drain any moisture toward the exit chimney where it could evaporate. He lined each trench bottom with a 2-inch layer of coarse sand. The sand served multiple purposes. It provided a level base for pipes, allowed drainage, and would help distribute heat evenly. He had hauled the sand from a creek bed 2 miles away, carrying it in leather bags over 3 trips. Installing the pipes required precision. Each clay section was 2 feet long, with a socket joint on one end and a tapered spigot on the other. Sections fitted together by inserting the spigot into the socket of the previous section. James started at the fireplace. He had modified the firebox by creating an opening at the back low and to one side where the first pipe section would connect. He built a clay collar around this opening, creating a sealed transition from firebox to pipe. The first pipe section angled down slightly as it left the fireplace, beginning the gradual slope toward the exit. James fitted the second section to the first, checking alignment carefully. The joints had to be sealed against air leaks. He mixed mortar using clay, lime, and fine sand, creating a thick paste. He packed this mortar around each joint, smoothing it carefully. Air escaping through gaps would reduce system efficiency and could fill the cabin with smoke. Each section had to be perfectly aligned. James used a level and straight edge adjusting pipe position in the sand bed until the slope matched his calculations. The work was slow. By evening of the first installation day, he had placed only 8 sections covering 16 feet of the main channel. James spent the next week completing the pipe installation. The main channel required 15 sections to span from fireplace to the north wall. Each joint was sealed with his clay lime mortar. He allowed the mortar to dry for a full day before proceeding, ensuring each connection was solid. The lateral branches were more complex. Each branch required 6 pipe sections to extend 8 feet from the main trunk. But the branches did not draw air from the fireplace directly. Instead, James created openings in the main trunk pipe by carefully cutting slots in the clay sections where branches would connect. These openings were 4 inches in diameter, small enough to maintain good airflow in the main channel, while allowing hot air to spill into the lateral branches. Cutting the clay pipes without shattering them required patience. James used a small hacksaw, working slowly to score the clay before tapping gently with a mallet to break through. He created 4 branch openings spaced evenly along the main trunk. At each opening, he built a Y-junction using clay and mortar, connecting the branch pipe to the main channel. The branch pipes extended outward and terminated in clay caps he had fashioned himself. These caps sealed the branch ends while allowing heat to radiate through the clay into surrounding earth. The iron bands he had purchased in St. Louis served as reinforcement at critical junctions. James wrapped bands around the Y connections where branches met the main trunk, then secured them with wire. The bands prevented the hand-formed clay junctions from cracking under thermal stress when hot air began flowing through the system. By late September, all pipes were installed. The underground network lay complete in its trenches, waiting to be buried. James performed a test before backfilling. He built a small fire in the fireplace and watched smoke behavior. Initially, smoke simply rose up the main chimney as it always had. But when he partially blocked the main chimney with a board forcing air to find another path, smoke began flowing into the underground channel. He could not see the smoke in the buried pipes, but he walked to the north wall where the exit chimney would be built. Smoke emerged from the open pipe end, confirming that air was traveling through the entire system. The test revealed a problem. Smoke also leaked from several joints where his mortar had not sealed completely. James spent 2 days repairing these leaks, applying additional mortar and allowing it to cure. He tested again. This time, smoke flowed through the underground channel without significant leakage. Satisfied with the pipes, James began backfilling. He did not simply dump earth back into the trenches. Instead, he used sand for the first 4 inches of cover directly over the pipes. Sand would conduct heat better than clay soil and would not hold moisture against the clay pipe. Above the sand layer, he replaced the original earth, packing it firmly, but not so densely that it would prevent heat radiation. The backfilling process took a full week. James worked methodically, filling each trench in layers and tamping the earth to prevent settling. He left small access hatches at 3 locations. These hatches were simple wooden boxes sunk into the floor with removable covers. They allowed him to inspect the pipes and clear any blockages without excavating the entire floor. By early October, the cabin floor was restored. The surface looked nearly as it had before James began his project, though slightly higher due to the added pipe infrastructure below. James smoothed the earth, wetting it and tamping until it hardened. He considered installing wooden planks over the entire floor, but decided against it initially. He wanted to observe how heat radiated through bare earth before adding another layer. The exit chimney remained to be built. This structure would carry smoke from the underground channel up through the roof and into open air. James gathered stones from the creek bed and began construction on the cabin's north wall. He built a chimney's base around the pipe exit, creating a sealed chamber where underground smoke would enter before rising. The chimney interior measured 8 inches square, smaller than his main fireplace chimney, but adequate for the reduced smoke volume after heat had been extracted underground. He built the chimney using the same river rock and clay mortar technique he had used for the fireplace. The structure rose through the cabin wall, requiring him to cut an opening in the logs. He sealed carefully around the stonework to prevent drafts. The chimney continued up the exterior wall and extended 3 feet above the roofline. At the top, he created a simple cap to prevent rain from entering while allowing smoke to escape. The construction took 5 days. When finished, James had 2 chimneys on his cabin. The main fireplace chimney on the south wall and the new exit chimney on the north wall. To neighbors who occasionally passed by, the dual chimney configuration looked strange and unnecessary. The final element was a damper system. James needed to control how much smoke traveled through the underground channels versus how much escaped directly up the main fireplace chimney. He fabricated a simple iron plate that could slide across the main chimney throat, partially blocking it and forcing more smoke into the underground system. The plate could be adjusted from inside the cabin using an iron rod. When fully open, the system would operate like a normal fireplace. When partially closed, it would force most exhaust through his underground heat distribution network. On October 12, 1843, James Whitmore stood in his rebuilt cabin and surveyed what he had created. The floor looked normal. The fireplace appeared unchanged except for a small opening at the back where pipes connected. The exit chimney rose on the north wall, functional and properly sealed. The entire system was complete. Whether it would work as theorized remained unknown. October 13th dawned cold and clear. Overnight temperatures had dropped to 20 degrees. Inside the cabin, James could see his breath in the still air. He had not lit a fire since completing the system, wanting to start with a complete test rather than gradual trials. He prepared carefully. He cleaned ash from the firebox and inspected the damper mechanism one final time. He checked the exit chimney exterior, ensuring no debris blocked the opening. He opened the small access hatches in the floor to observe the underground pipes directly. Everything appeared ready. At mid-morning, James built a fire. He started with kindling and small branches, establishing flames before adding larger wood. The fire caught easily. Smoke rose up the main chimney as it always had. The cabin began warming in the familiar pattern, heat radiating from the firebox into the immediate area. James waited until the fire burned hot and steady. Then he reached for the damper rod and slowly closed the main chimney throat halfway. The effect was immediate. Smoke that had been rising freely now encountered resistance. It swirled in the firebox, seeking escape. Within seconds, smoke began flowing through the opening at the back of the firebox, entering the underground pipe system. James moved to the first access hatch and peered down. He could see heat shimmer in the air above the buried pipe. He could not see smoke moving through the clay sections, but he could hear a soft rushing sound as hot air traveled through the channel. He walked to the north wall where the exit chimney rose. Smoke emerged from the top, flowing steadily upward. The system was functioning. Hot exhaust from the fireplace was traveling 20 feet through underground pipes before venting to the atmosphere. James closed the damper further, forcing more smoke into the underground system. The fire responded by burning hotter, drawing harder to pull air through the restricted chimney. He found a balance point where the damper was 3/4 closed. At this setting, most smoke traveled underground, while enough escaped through the main chimney to prevent backup into the cabin. He maintained the fire through the afternoon, adding wood regularly. After 2 hours, he knelt and placed his palm on the cabin floor. The earth was noticeably warm, not hot enough to burn, but distinctly warmer than it had been. He checked different locations. Directly above the main channel, the floor was warmest. Above the lateral branches, heat was less intense, but still present. In areas without pipes below the floor, remained cool. By evening, the temperature difference was dramatic. James walked barefoot across his floor and could trace the underground pipe pattern by feel alone. Where pipes ran below the earth radiated gentle warmth. His feet, which would normally be cold on frozen ground, were comfortable. He let the fire burn through the night, maintaining steady heat. By morning of October 14th, the cabin floor had become a radiant, heating surface. The warmth rising from below changed the entire cabin's temperature profile. Instead of heat collecting near the ceiling, the warmth started at floor level and filled the space evenly. James knelt on the warm floor and placed his forehead against the packed earth. For the first time since January, tears came. "Eleanor," he whispered. "Benjamin. Sarah. I did it. The floor is warm. No more children will die on this floor." November brought the first serious cold. Temperatures dropped into the teens at night, rising only to the 30s during daylight hours. Light snow fell intermittently. Settlers throughout the territory began their annual preparations for winter, stockpiling firewood in ceiling cabins against drafts. James maintained his underground heating system, learning its characteristics through daily use. He discovered that the system responded slowly to changes. When he built up the fire, the floor did not warm immediately. Heat took 30 to 40 minutes to travel through the pipes and saturate the surrounding earth. But once warm, the floor retained heat for hours. He could let the fire die to coals at bedtime, and the floor would remain warm until morning. He learned to manage the damper setting. Fully closed created too much back pressure and filled the cabin with smoke. Fully open sent heat up the main chimney, defeating the system's purpose. The optimal setting was approximately 70% closed, forcing most exhaust underground, while maintaining adequate draft for the fire to burn cleanly. Wood consumption was lower than previous winters. The efficient heat capture meant James burned roughly 30% less firewood to maintain comfortable temperatures. Heat that previously escaped up the chimney now warmed his living space. By early December, word had spread that James's strange heating system apparently functioned. Settlers who had mocked him now expressed cautious curiosity. A few stopped by to see the dual chimney configuration and ask questions. James explained the principles willingly, but did not push anyone to adopt his methods. He showed them the access hatches, demonstrated the damper mechanism, walked them through the basic physics. Some took notes, others listened politely but remained skeptical. December brought colder weather. By mid-month, nighttime temperatures regularly reached 0 or below. This was when the system's true value became apparent. Other cabins required constant fire maintenance. Settlers woke multiple times per night to add wood fighting to keep interior temperatures above freezing. Their floors remained frozen solid. Children slept in layers of clothing under piled blankets, waking each morning, shivering and miserable. James's cabin told a different story. He maintained a moderate fire, nothing excessive. The underground pipes distributed heat throughout the floor. The warmed earth radiated heat upward continuously. The cabin's interior temperature remained steady at 60 to 65 degrees. The floor itself stayed between 70 and 75 degrees, warm enough to walk on comfortably without boots. He could sleep through the night without tending the fire. The system's thermal mass carried heat for 6 to 8 hours after flames died to coals. Morning fires were smaller, just enough to replenish heat rather than fighting extreme cold from scratch. On December 18th, the temperature dropped to 15 below zero overnight. James woke in a cabin that felt comfortable. He walked barefoot to the fireplace and built a small fire. Within an hour, the cabin was warm enough that he worked in shirt sleeves. Outside, the Wyoming winter held the land in brutal cold. Inside, James lived in conditions that would have seemed impossible the previous year. His family had died in temperatures like this. Now he survived comfortably using principles they had never known. On December 20th, Silas Morton arrived at James's cabin. The visit was ostensibly a neighborly check during harsh weather. But Silas's real motivation was curiosity. He had heard reports from other settlers about Whitmore's warm cabin. He needed to see for himself whether the stories were true or exaggerated. Silas knocked and entered when James called out. The difference hit him immediately. Outside, the temperature held at 10 below zero. Silas wore a heavy wool coat, fur hat, thick gloves, and insulated boots. His face was red from cold. His breath formed dense clouds in the frozen air. Inside James's cabin, the air felt warm enough to be comfortable. Silas's eyes adjusted to the interior dimness. He saw James standing near the table wearing only a cotton shirt and canvas work pants. No coat, no blanket around his shoulders. And most startling, James was barefoot. "How are you not freezing?" he said. The question came out sharper than intended, driven by genuine confusion. James gestured to the fireplace where a modest fire burned. "The floor is warm," he said simply. "Walk on it." Silas did not move immediately. The statement seemed impossible. Cabin floors in winter were frozen. Everyone knew this. "You cannot have warm floors in December," Silas said. James walked across the cabin, his bare feet moving normally over the earth floor. He stopped near Silas. "Touch the floor. Prove it to yourself." Silas hesitated, then removed one glove and knelt. He placed his palm on the packed earth floor. The surface was warm. Not slightly warm, not tepid, genuinely warm like sun-heated stone in summer. He moved to a different location and touched again. Warm. He walked to the far corner and tested. Still warm, though slightly less intense than near the fireplace. He stood slowly, trying to reconcile physical evidence with his understanding of how cabins worked. "This is not possible," he said. "Heat rises. Floors cannot be warm. The heat travels under the floor before it rises," James explained. "The pipes I buried carry hot air from the fireplace across the cabin and out through the north chimney. As the hot air travels underground, it warms the earth. The warmed earth radiates heat upward." Silas looked at the floor with new understanding. "The entire floor is heated. Most of it," James confirmed. "The areas directly above the pipes are warmest, but heat spreads through the earth so the whole floor stays above freezing." Silas removed his other glove and his heavy coat. The cabin's warmth made the winter clothing unnecessary. He sat on James's chair, still processing what he was experiencing. "You were right," Silas said quietly. "I mocked you. I told others you had gone mad. But this works. This actually works." James added a log to his fire. The fire was small compared to the roaring blazes most settlers maintained. "I am burning less wood than you are," James said, and staying warmer. 4 miles northeast of James's cabin stood the home of Henry Pritchard. Henry lived there with his wife Mary and their 3 children. Samuel was 8 years old, Rebecca was 6, and Thomas was 3. The family had settled in Wyoming 2 years earlier and had survived one winter adequately. The current winter was proving more difficult. By early January 1844, all 3 Pritchard children were sick. Not severely ill, but suffering from persistent coughs and low fevers that would not resolve. Mary kept them close to the fire constantly, but the cabin's temperature remained barely above freezing, except within a few feet of the flames. The children slept together under every blanket the family owned, but woke each morning shivering and miserable. Henry burned wood frantically, feeding the fire day and night. His carefully stockpiled firewood was disappearing faster than he had planned. At the current consumption rate, he would run out by late February, leaving 6 weeks of winter with insufficient fuel. On January 7th, Rebecca's cough worsened significantly. She developed a high fever and began having trouble breathing. Mary dosed her with willow bark tea and kept her wrapped in blankets near the fire, but the child's condition deteriorated. By January 9th, Henry faced the reality that his daughter might die if conditions did not change. That morning, he rode to James's cabin through bitter cold. He arrived mid-morning and knocked urgently. James opened the door and saw Henry's desperate expression immediately. "Rebecca is very sick," Henry said without preamble. "She cannot get warm. Our cabin is freezing no matter how much wood I burn. I need help." James invited him inside. Henry stepped into warmth that made him want to weep. The contrast between his frigid cabin and James's comfortable space was devastating. "I need you to teach me," Henry said. "I need to build what you built. I do not care if it takes weeks. I do not care if people think I am crazy. My children are suffering." James did not hesitate. "We start today," he said. The construction would take time. Henry did not have if Rebecca was critically ill. James made a quick decision. "Bring your family here," he said. "They can stay in my cabin while we build your heating system. Your children will be warm and safe. Mary can tend Rebecca here. We will work on your cabin during daylight hours." Henry's relief was visible. Within 2 hours, the Pritchard family had relocated to James's cabin. Mary settled the children near James's fireplace, spreading blankets on the warm floor. The children, accustomed to sleeping on frozen ground, were astonished by the heated surface. Rebecca's breathing eased almost immediately in the warmer air. James and Henry rode to the Pritchard cabin and began planning. The structure was similar to James's, slightly smaller at 14 feet by 18 feet. James sketched a pipe layout adapted to the reduced size. one main channel, three lateral branches. They would need fewer pipes, but the same principles would apply. Over the next 3 weeks, James guided Henry through every step. They excavated trenches following the pattern James had developed. They installed clay pipes with meticulous attention to joint sealing. They built the exit chimney and damper system. Henry worked like a man possessed, knowing his daughter's life might depend on getting this right. Rebecca recovered fully within 2 weeks of staying in James's warm cabin. When the Pritchard family moved back into their own home, now equipped with underground heating, all three children slept warm for the first time that winter. Henry stood in his cabin on the first night, feeling heat radiate from the floor beneath his feet, and wept with gratitude. Through late January and February of 1844, winter progressed with brutal cold that tested every settler's preparation and resolve. The Pritchard family remained healthy in their newly heated cabin. Other children in the territory were not as fortunate. Pneumonia and cold-related illnesses moved through the scattered homesteads, taking lives with grim regularity. By late February 9, settlers had stopped by James's cabin to ask questions about his heating system. Most came hesitantly, embarrassed by their earlier mockery, but driven by genuine need. James received them without judgment and explained the principles patiently. He showed them his pipe layout, demonstrated the damper mechanism, and walked them through the construction process. Some took notes, others simply observed and asked questions. In March, as weather began moderating slightly, construction started on 4 new underground heating systems. James helped where he could, offering advice and occasionally lending tools. Each builder adapted the basic design to their specific cabin dimensions and available materials. Variations emerged. A trapper named William Foster built his system using hollowed logs instead of clay pipes, sealing them with pitch and clay. The system worked adequately, though not as efficiently as fired clay. A Norwegian settler named Henrik Larsson created a variation that used a single long spiral channel instead of the branching pattern James had designed. Larsson's floor heated less evenly, but required fewer materials. The important principle, heat distribution through underground channels, proved adaptable to different implementations. In early April, Silas Morton began his construction. He came to James, first hat literally in hand, and apologized formally for his mockery and doubt. James accepted the apology simply and spent 3 days helping Silas excavate trenches and plan his pipe layout. Silas's cabin was larger than most, requiring an extended network of channels. The construction took 5 weeks, but produced exceptional results. By May, 7 cabins in the Wyoming Territory had underground heating systems. News traveled beyond the immediate area. Trappers and traders carried stories of Whitmore's warm floors to other settlements. Some listeners dismissed the accounts as exaggeration. Others filed the information away for future consideration. Owen Blackwood, who operated the trading post 40 miles east, heard multiple versions of the story from different sources. In June, he rode to James's cabin, specifically to investigate. Blackwood was a practical businessman. He dealt in supplies and information, always looking for opportunities. He examined James's system carefully, asked detailed questions about materials and construction methods, and walked through the physics with genuine interest. This could change how people build on the frontier, Blackwood said. Winter kills more settlers than Indians or accidents. A heating system that actually works could save lives. James agreed, but offered no commercial ambitions. He had built his system to survive, not to profit. Blackwood saw different possibilities. When he returned to his trading post, he began stocking clay drainage pipes, lime for mortar, and iron reinforcement bands. He created a simple instruction sheet based on James's design and offered it free to anyone interested. By autumn of 1844, 17 cabins across the territory had underground heating systems either completed or under construction. The number grew through word of mouth and practical demonstration. Settlers who visited heated cabins became convinced. Those who spent a winter in traditional frozen cabins, while neighbors stayed comfortable, often began construction the following spring. Blackwood began offering installation assistance for a fee. He hired 2 men who had built systems for their own cabins to work as consultants during winter months when other work was scarce. These men would travel to a homestead, help plan the pipe layout, assist with excavation, and ensure proper installation. The service cost $20. Expensive by frontier standards, but worthwhile for families who lacked construction experience. Through this consulting service, another 30 systems were built during 1845 in 1846. The installation spread beyond Wyoming into Montana and Idaho territories. Variations developed based on local materials and builder preferences. Some used stone channels instead of clay pipes. Others created systems with centralized manifolds feeding multiple floor zones. The core principle remained constant: capture waste heat from fireplaces and chimneys, route it through underground channels, warm the floor from below. By 1847, Blackwood estimated that over 80 cabins in the northern Rocky Mountain region used underground heating. The actual number was likely higher, as many builders created systems without purchasing materials from his trading post. The innovation had spread organically, carried by satisfied users and practical demonstration. James Whitmore never remarried. He lived alone in his cabin for 6 more years after completing the heating system. He continued trapping and farming, maintaining a solitary but functional existence. Neighbors remained respectful but distant. James had changed after his family's death, becoming quieter and more withdrawn. The obsessive energy that had driven his innovation faded once the system was complete and proven. In 1849, James sold his Wyoming land to a young couple from Ohio. He explained the heating system's operation, carefully showed them the access hatches and damper mechanism, and provided detailed instructions for maintenance. The couple, grateful for the improved cabin, offered to pay extra for the installation. James refused additional money. "The system is part of the cabin," he said, "not a separate commodity." He moved west to the Oregon Territory, seeking distance from memories that would not fade. He purchased land in the Willamette Valley and built a small house, standard construction, without underground heating. The Oregon climate was milder than Wyoming. Extreme heating systems were unnecessary. He lived there quietly until his death in 1868 at age 57. His Oregon neighbors knew him as a reserved man who farmed competently and kept to himself. Few knew about his Wyoming years or the innovation he had developed. But in Wyoming, Montana, Idaho, and beyond, cabins with warm floors continued serving families through brutal winters. By 1850, the systems were common enough that they no longer seemed remarkable. New settlers arriving in the territory often found cabins already equipped with underground heating and assumed this was standard frontier construction. The technique became known by various names. Some called them Whitmore floors after James. Others used terms like buried flue cabins or underfloor heating. A few settlers claimed to have invented the systems independently, and perhaps some had through parallel discovery. The specific attribution mattered less than the practical reality. Children slept warm on winter nights. Families survived cold that would have killed them in traditional cabins. Wood supplies lasted longer, reducing the desperate fuel gathering that had consumed so much frontier labor. Modern historians examining homestead records note a measurable decline in winter mortality in regions where underground heating systems were adopted. The effect was not dramatic enough to be obvious in individual settlements, but showed clearly in aggregate data across the territories. Families living in heated cabins experienced roughly 30% fewer cold-related deaths than those in traditional structures. The innovation eventually became obsolete. By the 1870s, manufactured iron stoves were widely available and provided more efficient heating than fireplace-based systems. By the 1890s, many frontier cabins were being replaced by frame houses with modern heating. The underground pipe systems were gradually abandoned as old cabins deteriorated or were torn down. But the principle James Whitmore had proven remained valid. Waste heat could be captured and redistributed. Floors could be warmed from below. Intelligent engineering could solve problems that seemed inevitable. In the winter of 1875, 32 years after James completed his system, a young family named Daniel and Martha Cooper migrated to Wyoming with their 4 children. They purchased an old cabin from a retiring settler. The cabin had an unusual structure: 2 chimneys, a slightly elevated floor. The seller explained, "This cabin has a special heating system, built by a man named James Whitmore in 1843. He lost his whole family to the cold, then invented this. Saved hundreds of lives." Daniel was skeptical. "Just an old cabin," he said. That first winter, temperatures dropped to 20 below zero. Daniel built a fire as instructed, adjusted the damper. Within 2 hours, the floor warmed. His wife Martha knelt and touched the floor, tears streaming down her face. "Our children can sleep warm," she whispered. Their 4 children lay on the warm floor, laughing and playing, not shivering, not afraid, safe. Daniel asked neighbors about James Whitmore. Most did not remember the name, but they remembered the system. He invented this after losing his wife and children, an old-timer said. People laughed at him, called him crazy, but he was right. How many cabins use this system, Daniel asked. Hundreds, the old-timer said, all across Wyoming, Montana, Idaho. We call them Whitmore floors, though most folks do not know who he was. Daniel found 3 graves 50 yards from the cabin, 3 weathered pine crosses, the letters faded but still legible. Eleanor Whitmore, 1817 to 1843. Benjamin Whitmore, 1840 to 1843. Sarah Whitmore, 1841 to 1843. Daniel knelt beside Eleanor's grave and placed his hand on the earth. You did not die for nothing, he said softly. Your husband saved my children, and hundreds of others. Years later in 1920, an elderly Daniel Cooper would tell his grandchildren about growing up in the Whitmore cabin. I am 73 now, he would say. I grew up in that cabin. All 4 of us survived Wyoming winters because of that warm floor. In 1895, I built a new house with a modern iron stove, tore down the old cabin. But before I did, I dug up part of that underground pipe system. Wanted to see what it looked like. Those clay pipes were 50 years old and still intact. The mortar joints still sealed. The earth around them still bore traces of heat absorbed over decades. I kept one section of pipe. It sits on my mantle now. Reminds me that the greatest people are not always famous, but the warmth they leave behind never dies. James Whitmore has no monument, no street named after him. Most people do not know who he was, but every child who slept warm on a frontier cabin floor, that is his legacy. And that legacy is immortal. The image that remains is of a single clay pipe section resting on a modern mantle. Firelight dances across its surface. Carved into the pipe are words Daniel Cooper etched in 1895. James Whitmore, 1811 to 1868. He turned grief into warmth and saved lives we will never count.